Way back in 1999, a retired U.S. Army colonel published an article with a title so provocative, it's still sparking arguments a quarter of a century later. That title? Why Arabs Lose Wars. Wow. It's a question that really cuts to the heart of modern military history in the Middle East. So let's dive into this really fascinating and, pretty complex debate.
So everything really kicks off with this central question. For decades, analysts, historians, even the soldiers themselves have been trying to figure out why. Why, despite often having huge numbers and really advanced weapons, many Arab armies have struggled in head-to-head conflicts. And this is where Colonel D. Atkine comes in. He'd spent years on the ground working with Arab militaries, and he kind of sidestepped all the usual explanations, things like economics or technology. Instead, he argued the real reason was something much deeper and way more controversial: culture. Okay, so first things first, let's really break down D. Atkine's original argument from 1999. It's a really influential perspective, one that's shaped military thinking for years, so it's important to get what he was saying.
Atkine's main idea was, blunt. He argued that it wasn't about a lack of bravery or anything like that. For him, it was about specific cultural patterns that, he believed, created these deep-seated weaknesses that are just incredibly hard to overcome on a modern battlefield. And he got specific. He listed out several key problems he called cultural inhibitors. Things like hoarding information instead of sharing it, an education system that prized just memorizing facts over actually analyzing them, and a rigid hierarchy that basically crushed any sense of initiative in younger officers. He also pointed to this huge social canyon between officers and their men, and maybe most importantly, the lack of a professional NCO corps, the sergeants, the real backbone of most Western armies. To really illustrate that gap between officers and their troops, Atkine told this really striking story. He saw Egyptian soldiers being marched out and ordered to stand in a line just to act as a human windbreak to shield dignitaries from blowing sand. For him, this was just a perfect symbol of a system where enlisted men weren't valued, weren't trained, and definitely weren't trusted.
Another huge point for him was this idea of information is power. What he saw was that an officer or a technician would learn a new skill and then just hoard that knowledge. Because if you share it, you're not indispensable anymore, right? But in a military, that's a disaster. It means no cross-training. So if your tank gunner gets hit, the driver can't just jump in and take his place, and the whole crew, the whole tank, just falls apart.
He also talked about what he saw as this vicious cycle of blame. Say some expensive American-made equipment failed. The problem was almost never identified as, a lack of maintenance or poor training. Instead, commanders would do anything to avoid sending bad news up the chain of command. So the blame would get shifted. The equipment was too delicate, or the American supply system was too slow, and the results? The real core issues never, ever got fixed. So, okay, that's the thesis from 1999. It's a pretty harsh critique, but you gotta ask, how does it hold up today? And maybe more importantly, how do people from the region itself respond to all this?
Well, let's fast forward 25 years. Not too long ago, that article was translated into Arabic and posted on the Arab Defense Forum, which is a really popular online spot for military buffs in the region. And it absolutely ignited a firestorm of debate.
The responses weren't just a simple yes or no. They were nuanced, they were passionate, and they came from all kinds of different viewpoints. And together, they offer this powerful counter-narrative to Atkine's whole cultural argument. It's a really rare chance to get a direct view from within.
The forum discussion brought up several really important counterarguments. So let's explore what they believe are the real reasons for military struggles.
So looking at the discussion, the critiques kind of fell into a few main buckets. The biggest one, by far, was the massive technology gap between Arab armies and their opponents. But other big themes came up too. The role of faith, the argument that D. Atkine's analysis is just plain outdated, and a bunch of other factors like geography.
This quote from a forum member named KTALM just powerfully nails that technology argument. He's saying, look, even the best soldiers on Earth can't win when their gear is 2 or 3 generations behind. And then he gives this jaw-dropping example of Egyptian jets in past wars literally running out of fuel in the middle of a dogfight because their planes were just so much less capable than their opponents. So here's the bottom line. We have 2 completely different sets of explanations. This table kind of lays it all out. Where D. Atkine sees culture as the root of all problems, the forum members point straight to technology. Where he describes the static, unchanging military culture, they fire back that, hey, a lot has changed since the 90s, especially in the Gulf. They also hit him for taking his experience with one army and generalizing it to all Arab armies, and for kind of glossing over the fact that in the Iran-Iraq War, Iran often had more troops and better tech.
But it wasn't just about technology and politics. Another really powerful theme kept coming up in the discussion: the role of religion. For some of these forum members, you just can't separate the question of victory and defeat from faith. This perspective is perfectly captured in this quote from a user named Alp Arslan. He's referencing a famous saying by the second caliph Omar ibn al-Khattab. And the argument here is basically that, for Arabs, military strength and honor are fundamentally tied to their commitment to Islam. And if they seek strength through Western military models or secular ideas, well, in this view, that's just a recipe for divine humiliation and ultimately defeat.
And what about the idea that Atkine's article is just old news? A forum member named Khalid88 makes this point directly. He says, look, maybe Atkine's observations were true for that specific time, but the 1991 Gulf War was a massive wake-up call. He claims that, at least in his home country in the Gulf, a long, slow process of modernization and professionalization kicked off right after that war, which makes a 1999 analysis basically obsolete.
So where does this all leave us? You've got a 25-year-old cultural critique on one side, and on the other, you've got this passionate, modern, and multifaceted rebuttal. What this whole debate really shows us are two fundamentally different ways of thinking about what makes an army actually win or lose. And this isn't just about one article. It's really a clash of worldviews. So on one hand, you've got what we could call the culturalist view, the Atkine view. It argues that it's the intangible stuff, the software of an army, its culture, its leadership, the trust between soldiers. That's what really makes the difference. But on the other hand, you have the materialist and political view from the forum members. And they argue that no, it's the hardware, the technology, the political systems that fund the military, and the ideological fire in the troops' bellies that are the really decisive factors. In the end, what this fascinating back and forth across 25 years really proves is that there is no simple answer here. The question of why any army wins or loses is just incredibly complex. It's a messy mix of culture, tech, politics, leadership, and a dozen other things that are pretty much impossible to untangle. And that really brings us to the final thought. This whole debate, sparked by one article all those years ago, keeps going because the question at its very core is universal. It's timeless. What is the most critical ingredient for victory? Is it the cultural software that shapes a soldier's mind, the advanced hardware they carry into a fight, the political system that points them in the right direction, or the faith that fuels their spirit? The answer, it seems, is still being fiercely debated on battlefields and in forums all over the world.